Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. Good morning, everybody. First, please forgive me if I sound a little raspy. I am getting over a cold, but I am here. So if this is the very first time you've ever heard my voice, I'm Leah M. Forney. I'm the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate and Training Assistant here at MCASA. And I'm super excited to be with you again to teach you on how to serve sexual assault survivors from underserved populations. So during this training, we're going to go over a few things. We're going to talk about underserved populations as a whole. We're going to discuss identity, oppression, trauma. We'll also talk a little bit about barriers to access. And then we'll talk a little bit about moving forward using our socio-ecology model as well as equity. So, what do we mean when we talk about underserved populations, right? We know that sexual assault as a whole is underserved, right? But we also know that sexual violence is 100% preventable. Yet it's still happening, right? Every single day, someone is impacted by sexual assault, and it doesn't just impact one person, it impacts all identities and all backgrounds, right? And so, all sexual abuse survivors experience barriers to justice and healing that they deserve. And so during out this training, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some of those barriers and some of the trauma that impacts these intersecting identities that survivors oftentimes are facing. While we know that survivors may be underserved, we also know in our organizations, this can affect how we show up, right? It can affect our cultural attitudes, our beliefs, their identity. And oftentimes, this lack of awareness and understanding around identity and the systematic process affects why survivors oftentimes do not report or ask for help. So let's talk about identity real quick. Now, I will tell you right now, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just some brief different identities that we all adhere to. So the first one is age, right? And so we know that when we're talking about age, oftentimes it is categorized into younger people versus older people, right? And then we have race, right? So race, when we're talking about race, we're often talking about, the social construct around race. So we're looking at skin color when we're talking about race. So black, brown, white, mixed race, biracial, multiracial, right? That's race. And then we have ethnicity. So ethnicity is oftentimes where we talk about things like heritage, language, right? Cultural things. So like that's where we hear things like Latinx or Afro-Caribbean or Pacific Islander. That's ethnicity, right? And then we have natural origin. So natural origin is basically where someone is born geographically. So this is where we get into things like Australian, German, Japanese, right? All of those things are natural origin. And then you have skin color. So skin color, we're looking at things like light skin, dark skin, brown. Skin color is oftentimes what's intersect with race, right? So you can say for example, someone can be black and light skinned, or black and dark skinned, right? So we tend to see the intersection between those two. And then we have disability. So disability is we looking at mental illness, physical disability, cognitive disability. Another identity that we tend to see is deaf and or hard of hearing. So again, this identity tends to intersect with disability as well, right? And so we always want to be mindful of this identity, especially in our workplaces and in our organizations. Um, Faith, religion, and spirituality can be another identity, right? How somebody identifies with their faith, their religious beliefs, their spiritual beliefs. Gender identity and gender expression. Oftentimes, this is how someone identifies, right? Outside of what they were assigned at birth. right? So typically we see man, woman, cisgender, transgender, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, gender queer, feminine, masculine, all of those are gender identity and expression. And then we have sexual and or romantic orientation. So this is how we identify in terms of who we're attracted to, whether it's sexually or romantically, right? So this is where we get identities like lesbian, bisexual, gay, asexual, right? Biromantic, queer, just to name a few. Of course, we have socioeconomic statuses and class, right? And this is where we kind of see things like upper middle class, wealthy, rich, poor, right? All of those things are socioeconomic status and class. Tribal or indigenous affiliation, right? So this is where we get into those survivors who are of the indigenous communities and kind of begin to identify the different tribes they're a part of. First language. So first language is a language that someone learns to speak first, right? So we know that there are some people that are not English speaking first, so they might be, been first to speak Spanish or French, right? So that's what we mean by first language. Immigration status. So at immigration status, we're looking at, are they a citizen? Are they temporary or permanent resident? Are they refugees? Are they undocumented? And then the last type of identity is body size or type. So this is where we oftentimes see weight discrimination, right? Because then we begin to have our own biases and prejudice against individuals with certain body types. So now let's talk a little bit about intersectionality. And so intersectionality was first coined by a lawyer and a professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia School of Law, Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was termed in 1989 to describe the intersection of identities and power. So, for example, Ms. Crenshaw would discuss how a Black man can experience discrimination because he's Black. A white woman can experience discrimination because she's a woman. A Black woman, however, can experience a different type of discrimination because she is both a woman and Black. And so when she would teach on intersectionality, she wanted us to understand how intersecting identities play a major role in the type of treatment and the type of discrimination one can receive. And so, as organizations, it is going to be very important that we are paying attention to the policies that we produce, the hiring practices that we produce, to make sure that um, we are not being discriminatory based on the intersection of people's identities. So let's talk a little bit about oppression. So, by definition, oppression really means a perpetual state of disadvantage. So, oftentimes when we think oppression, we look at things like historic, systematic, ingrained, and traumatic, right? And all oppressions are perpetrated by the belief that there must be power over someone or something versus power shared, right? And so these are the types of beliefs that are embedded in the organizations, in the work, and even in the sexual assault, because it's based on hierarchy, right? It's based on who's above who. And so this is how we continue to see that sexual assault in particular is all about having power over someone who is powerless. So I want to break down oppression just a little deeper, right? So there's four elements of oppression. We have defined norms, right, what society deems normal. we have violence or threat of violence, and then we have institutional power and economic power. So from a defined norm standpoint, oppression can show up in race, it can show up in gender identity, it can show up in class, it can show up in ageism, it can show up in religion and spirituality. It can also show up in nativity, right, where you're from originally. And it can also show up in sexual orientation. Now, when it comes to violence or threat of violence, we tend to see oppression being used when it comes to physical violence, sexual violence, verbal abuse, intimidation, right? Because remember, oppression is about power over, not power shared, harassment, right? So this is where we get into things like sexual harassment, workplace harassment, right? It's typically someone that is of a higher level or a higher department than you that's now being oppressive, right? And so they're harassing you or they're intimidating you. And then we also see it when it comes to institutional as well as the individual level, right? So in institutions, we see oppression, but we can also see it from individual to individual, right? So it could be your supervisor, right? Now being oppressive, right? And because they are above you or they have more power than you, right? That would make them the oppressor. From an institutional standpoint, how do we see our oppression? It can show up in our healthcare system, right? So if we think about it, when we are working with marginalized communities, underserved communities, right? Healthcare is a big reason why most survivors won't not only report, but they won't even go get a rape kit, right? Because it's this fear of the biases and the prejudice that's going to show up. It also shows up in our legal system, right? Again, we know this is one of the reasons why many survivors won't report, right? Because they don't believe that they'll be believed. It also can show up in the military, right? So when we are dealing with survivors on military bases, oftentimes the military handles sexual assault cases way different than the general population handles sexual assault, right? And so we have to look at the institutional power over there in the military. Law enforcement. Law enforcement plays a big role in why oppression continues to be a norm, if you will, right? Because again, when working with marginalized communities, there's this fear of not being believed. There's this fear of being in trouble versus the perpetrator being in trouble, right? There's this big mistrust with law enforcement. And so oftentimes that plays a role in whether or not someone will report. Then we have to look at our political representation. This one is very important because you want to start to think about who are you voting into office? Are they taking up this the standard of continuing oppression, or are they recognizing that oppression is a problem and they're willing to do something different about it? So we have to pay attention to our politics. We have to pay attention to who we're voting into office. And then educational system. So how is oppression showing up in the educational system? How is it showing up with individuals that we're teaching, the schools that our children go through to? How is it showing up? And then the last element of oppression is economic power. So how does oppression show up in our employment opportunities? For those of us who run organizations, are we making sure that we're not just hiring based off of diversity, right? So we're not checking a box. We're not saying, oh, I hired this Black person or I hired this Asian person, but we're really being intentional about who we're hiring, right? But then also credit. Oftentimes we find that a lot of victims of any type of abuse, sexual or domestic violence, right? Financial abuse is a form of economic power. It's also a form of oppression. And then our lending practices. So we're looking at banks, we're looking at our loans, right? Are they implementing oppression? Are they still making sure that it's a certain uh community, a certain type of people that get access to these things versus a different type of person. And then the last type of economical power that we see in oppression is college costs. Is it going to cost me as a Black woman more money to go to a Ivy League school than it would another race? All of these things make oppression. So, real quick, I want to do a quick activity with you that as you think about your own line of work, I want you to drop in the chat, what are some forms of oppression that you've seen in your own line of work? And I'll give you guys a few minutes. Oh, okay. I see requiring a driver's license and a car for a job. Misogyny and racism. Yep. Financial, homicide cases, Black on Black crime, queer phobia, transform phobia, sexism, xenophobia. These are good. Yep. Unfair punishment, racism, promotion, some racial inequality, socioeconomic, salary, immigration and undocumented folks not knowing where to reach out and are afraid to, politics, racism, pay, cultural immigration, legal system working against male and Black interpersonal violence victims. Let's see, preventing one from advancing too fast. That's a good one. Pay disparities, inequality or access to services. Yep. Requiring of experience for a job that's entry level. Yeah. Taking medical complaints seriously. Yes. No sick or vacation days offered. All of those are great examples of oppression. And so I want you all to keep these examples in mind as you are doing the work that we are called to do, right? Because oppression is everywhere. It shows up in every area of our lives. And so we always want to make sure that we're being mindful of it. And we also want to make sure that we are also not being the ones being the oppressor, right? So thank you for sharing. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the rape cultural pyramid. So this pyramid was actually designed by the Virginia Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Action Alliance, right? And this was a incredibly wonderfully done visual representation of the way in which oppression is the foundation for sexual violence. So the structural forms of oppression cultivate a society in which the attitudes, behaviors, and policies, right, higher up on the pyramid become prevalent and pervasive, right? So as you look at this pyramid, you can see the terms at the bottom are like the forming blocks that eventually create additional harmful behaviors and attitudes towards marginalized and minority people. So when it comes to sexual violence prevention, it cannot be successful without addressing the structural oppression, right? So we have to address the racism, we have to address the sexism, the ableism, the classism, the colonialism, the homophobia, the transphobia, the xenophobia. We have to address those things that's at the bottom. Because if we don't address our structural foundation, then this is how we continue to get up and up in the pyramid where we start having rape jokes, victim blaming, slut shaming, objectification. Boys will be boys, right? Entitlement, privilege. All of these things are as a result of not addressing what's at the root of oppression, especially in the work that we do. Okay. And so it is going to be very, very important as an organization and those who work in organizations that we pay attention to these things. And we ask ourselves, how is rape culture, if any, showing up in the work that we do and the work that we are doing to help survivors heal? So now I want to talk a little bit about trauma. So we know that trauma by definition is a emotional response, right? Or a normal response to an abnormal experience. So oftentimes trauma is we have a few types of trauma. So we have collective trauma. I always like to use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example of the collective trauma, right? Because all of us went through it, right? So we have collective trauma. We have historical trauma, cultural trauma, and then structurally induced trauma. Okay. So we know that when it comes to trauma, each survivor reacts to trauma in their own way. So some signs that you may encounter when working with a survivor right after being sexually assaulted might be flashbacks. There might be some triggers. There might be other symptoms of PTSD. Substance abuse might be a sign that they're dealing with some trauma, depression, right? So withdrawing from things that they used to love to do, withdrawing from family and friends, anxiety, right? So maybe you're encountering a survivor that's extremely anxious, right? Numbness or disassociation. So maybe you've encountered working with a survivor who just has no feeling at all. So they're very shut down. They don't let nobody in, right? Or they disassociated. So they kind of disconnected from the trauma. We oftentimes see signs of avoidance. So you might encounter working with a survivor who just doesn't want to talk about the trauma altogether. So they're avoiding it. Hyperarousal, right? So this is the person that can get easily startled, right? So they hear a car door slam, they jump. Somebody walks up on them without announcing themselves, they jump, right? So that's hyperarousal. An impact sense of identity. So oftentimes survivors struggle to reconnect with who they are, right? And so they begin to identify as a victim of sexual assault versus identifying as who they are on the inside. Eating disorders. So we tend to see a lot of survivors struggling with eating disorders, right? So whether they're not eating enough or they're binge eating. Sleep disorders. So we tend to see a lot of survivors struggling to stay asleep, right? Or go to sleep. Self-harm, right? Self-harm can be another sign that someone is struggling with a trauma. And then suicidal ideations or attempts is another sign that someone can be struggling with some form of trauma. Now, there are several types of trauma. And for the sake of our time together, we're not going to go through all of them today. But I do want to talk about these four, which is collective trauma, historical trauma, cultural trauma, and structurally induced trauma, right? So, collective trauma is basically trauma that impacts individuals and groups, right? So, that can be things like colonialization, gender based violence, institutional racism. As I mentioned before, COVID-19 pandemic, that was a collective trauma, right? Because it impacted a group of people or individuals. Police brutality, right, can be a collective trauma, especially when we saw it being shared out on social media platforms, right? Because the whole world saw it. That can be a collective trauma. And then we have historical trauma. So historical trauma looks at the emotional and psychological wounding of a particular group over a lifespan or over generations, right? So this can look like genocide, slavery, right? Environmental degradation, right? Those are some examples of historical trauma. And then we have transgenerational trauma, which looks at how trauma is passed from one generation after one generation, right? So this is when we get into things like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And we tend to see transgenerational trauma in like descendants of Holocaust survivors, for example. We found research has found that they tend to have elevated heart rates, right? So that's another type of historical trauma, transgenerational trauma. Um, Cultural trauma can occur when attempts are being made to eradicate a part of or all of a culture, right? So again, we're looking at the Holocaust, for example, right? We are looking at the treatment of indigenous people, homophobia, transphobia, white supremacy, genocide of a person, right? That's cultural trauma, right? Because, and the reason why we call it cultural trauma is because the practices are created to basically violate or harm another culture, right? So some of those practices that many of you may be aware of are like genital mutilation, right? The femininity versus masculinity conversations. In a lot of Black communities, we have the secrecy in the family or the secrecy in the church, right? A lot of that, what happens in this house stays in this house kind of stuff. And then the last type of trauma is structurally induced trauma. So this is trauma that's created by the policies that we put in our organizations. These are the policies that result in being unjust, unfair, abusive, maybe even racist, homophobic, and just unsafe all over. So some of those examples are like the policies around the prison system. So for example, the school to prison pipeline. That's a policy that's unsafe, unjust, and unfair, right? Border control. So we think about the policies around the US border, poverty, the welfare system, our public school system, conversations around mental health. All of these policies we want to pay attention to because they're going to really help us to determine whether or not we're creating policies that are going to be helpful for our survivors or not, right? The thing that I want you to understand is that these traumas are going to be so important to keep in your mind because when you're working with an individual who has survived sexual trauma, right, or sexual assault, they may be dealing with one of these traumas after the event, right? And so it's even more important to keep it in mind when working with marginalized identity individuals because not only have they lived a personal trauma, they may also be dealing with cultural trauma. They may be dealing with some transgenerational trauma. They may even be dealing with some historical trauma. And so all of these traumas combined impact their ability to seek help, to navigate support services, and their ability to heal from what has happened to them. Oh, I just realized it's funny. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the barriers or potential barriers to accessing support services. And this is mainly from survivors of underserved populations. Again, we know there are many reasons why someone will not accept or access services. We know there are plenty of barriers, right? Such as reporting barriers, feeling validated, feeling like their concerns are going to be addressed effectively. A lot of those barriers are ones we all know and have heard, like victim blaming, shame and embarrassment, fear that nobody's going to believe them, not wanting to think about what happened to them, wanting to avoid the trauma altogether, right? Not wanting to get involved in the criminal justice system, their connection to the perpetrator, or just fear of what will happen. So, all of these things are potential barriers as to why survivors of sexual assault won't access services. So for a moment in the chat, I want you to think about what are some other barriers that you can think of that may prevent a survivor from a marginalized community from seeking services. Drop some in the chat. Being undocumented, language barriers, yep. Homelessness, yep. Legal status, anymore. Culture, not knowing where to go. The perpetrator is a well-known member of the family or community. Yes, that's a good one. Stigma, that when seeking help, afraid that no one's going to believe them. Culturally, they don't want to identify as a victim. Trust, yes. Not being able to take time off of work, their profession, financial dependence, religion, lack of access to tech like the internet. No one's going to believe them. Being deaf, position of power, judgment, age. Yes, these are all great examples. Afraid of the authorities, guilt and shame. Yes, all of those are great examples of what we see survivors in marginalized communities face every single day. And so we're going to get into a conversation about the barriers to accessing services and barriers to accepting services because they're two separate barriers. So barriers to accessing services. From a communal standpoint, oftentimes what we see survivors in marginalized communities struggle with is their fear of being outed, right? Or fear of coming out, right? Especially those who are in marginalized communities and they're of the LGBTQIA plus community. This is one of their biggest fears, especially if they haven't shared with family or friends their gender expression or their sexual identity. So that's one of the major barriers that we tend to see is that if they go and seek services from a community standpoint, they're going to be outed, right? I'll give an example. I know of a personal someone that's close to me. This was one of his struggles when he had been sexually assaulted. Was that he had this conflict with his own sexual identity, and he was afraid that if he reported or he told someone that he was going to be outed. Another barrier that we tend to see when accessing services from a community standpoint is this fear of not being believed, right? Many survivors in marginalized communities feel like if I go and tell someone, who's going to believe them, right? So I've always shared my own personal story of being a survivor myself, and this was my biggest fear. It took me 2 days to report my sexual assault because of the fear of not being believed. Because the first thing that went through my mind was that I'm a Black woman, right? Who's going to believe this Black woman? And so this is a huge barrier, right? Because when someone doesn't feel like they're going to be believed, the likelihood of them actually seeking out services is slim to none. And then from a communal standpoint, we have the relationship with the offender, right? So oftentimes what gets tricky about sexual assault is that a lot of the victims and survivors have a relationship with the offender. So this could be their spouse, it could be the father or mother of their child. It can be a member of their family, a close family friend. So there's some type of connection to this person, right? And oftentimes that connection can also mean that this person that has perpetrated, they're depending on, right? So in a situation where there's a one income household, right? And the perpetrator is the one I have to depend on, what's the likelihood that I'm gonna report? It's very slim, right? So that plays a role in accessing services. And then there's the fear of what's gonna happen after the report. So once I come up with the courage to actually report, what happens next, right? What's gonna happen next? So those are some of those barriers that from a community standpoint, we see when accessing services. Now let's talk about the barriers from when working with advocates. So some of the barriers that we tend to see in marginalized communities is that there's this fear of how they or and their community will be perceived, right? So there's this fear about perception, right? Am I going to be looked at a different way? Am I going to be looked at like a victim? Am I going to be seen as less than because I'm coming out and telling you that I've been sexually assaulted? This one is really, really big, especially in the LGBTQIA population, but also with men survivors, right? There's a huge, huge barrier around perception because as a man, if I report that I've been sexually assaulted, then their fear is that you're not going to look at me as a man, right? So perception is a huge barrier. The other thing we see is fear of police brutality or other forms of violence, right, from the state. So we tend to see in marginalized communities, especially like communities of color, because there's a distrust with the police, they don't want to get the police involved. They don't want to report. And so that's another barrier because then they start to think, well, if I go and tell someone what happened to me, and the next thing they say is, oh, I have to call the police or we have to report, they're going in another direction because they don't want to get the police involved. And so another barrier we also see when accessing services is the fear that service providers will not understand or affirm their identities. This is really, really big in the LGBTQIA plus community, as well as the transgender community, because their pronouns, their identities is everything to them. And so if we are a service provider and we're providing a service and we don't understand it or we don't affirm it, that can be a huge barrier to keep them from coming through your doors. So now let's talk a little bit about accepting services, right? So we know that there are two different barriers, right? Accessing services oftentimes looks like getting them to walk through the doors, right? Accepting services is now they've walked through the door. What's going to keep them from walking out, right? What's going to keep them from actually accepting the help that they came in your doors for? And so we're going to break it down from a communal and a advocacy standpoint. So from community based, what keeps them from accepting services is stigma and shame, right? Think about that from even a mental health standpoint, right? Oftentimes, abuse of any kind, mental health disorders, has stigma and shame attached to it, right? And so again, I might not accept the help because I don't want to be a stigma, or I might not accept the help because I'm too ashamed to accept the help. I'm too ashamed to say I need help or there's something going on, right? And then we have the distrust in the legal system. So now I've walked through your doors. Now I have asked for help, but I don't necessarily trust the system that has been designed to help me, right? So that distrust will keep me from going to court, will keep me from making the police report, will keep me from asking for a restraining order, right? And so we want to think about that when we're working with survivors as they come through our doors. This distrust plays a huge role in why they won't accept help. Then you tack that on to cultural barriers, right? Such as secrecy in the household, right? In a lot of communities of color, right, secrecy is big. We don't talk about it, right? If you think about at one time in the military, they used to abide by don't ask, don't tell, right? Secrecy. When things become when conversations become secrets, that plays a huge role in my ability to accept services, right? Because if I think about it in my community as a Black woman, growing up in a household where it was always what happens in this house stays in this house, right? And so if I'm being abused, if I'm being victimized, if something is happening to me and I feel unsafe because of secrecy, I'm not supposed to tell nobody. So for a lot of our survivors that are coming through our doors, they're coming through our doors with that in mind. I'm not really supposed to be telling nobody that mommy's boyfriend did something, or my dad is touching me, or my uncle has violated me. So we got to keep that in mind. Then you tack that on with historical trauma, right? We just talked about it, right? So oftentimes, especially in communities of color, we've seen that people of color have been experimented on, right? So we think about the Tuskegee Airmen and the syphilis experiment. That's a huge barrier because when people of color begin to think of the historical trauma that their people have endured, that plays a role. It's not that I don't want help, I'm terrified. Because how do I know that I'm not going to be experimented on? Or how am I to know that I can trust you? Got to think about those things when we're working with our survivors. Another barrier from a communal standpoint is gender and sexual orientation stigma, right? This is why it's so important that we be gender affirming in our organizations. This is why pronouns and adhering to people's pronouns has got to be important because they're coming in our doors with this ideology that if I tell them that I identify as a man, but I present as a woman, that I'm not going to be getting the help that I deserve or need. And then inadequate healthcare systems, right? This is a huge barrier, right? Especially for our survivors who may live in rural communities, right? Where there's very limited healthcare systems, or even our survivors that live in city like or urban communities, right? Some of the gooder or better healthcare systems might be further away. And so if you don't have transportation, if you don't have a way to get there, the likelihood that you're going to go to a place where you get the real services and the help you need is going to be slim to none. So that's barriers of accepting its services from a community standpoint. Now let's talk a little bit about what it looks like when working with advocates like us. So some of the barriers to accepting services is the lack of representation. Many survivors in marginalized communities want to work with someone that looks like them. And so when there's a lack of representation, oftentimes that could be a barrier, right? Because to them, it is a feeling of, well, you're not going to get it. You're not going to understand because you're not Black or you're not Indigenous or you don't identify as the LGBTQIA plus community, right? All of those things can play a role in why someone won't accept help. And so from an organizational standpoint, it's going to be very important that when we're doing hiring, that we keep representation in mind, especially when our organizations are servicing marginalized communities, right? We want to make sure that we are keeping the fact that our population, our target audience needs to see more people that look like them. And then we have economic disparities, right? Such as not earning a livable wage. So for a lot of survivors, what can be a barrier to accepting services is how much is this going to cost me, right? Is it going to cost them more money to get the help that they're looking for, right? And if so, how does that play a role, right? Because if they're barely making enough money because they haven't earned a livable wage, right? Then how does that translate into walking in our doors and getting the help that they need? So we want to think about that. We want to think about the economic disparities that many survivors in marginalized communities are up against, and that is why they won't accept the help. Institutional barriers, right? So such as the lack of proper procedures, right? Are we, again, going back to policies, are we ensuring that our policies are created so that survivors feel safe, they feel heard, they feel respected, right? Or do we have the type of policies and procedures that ignore these intersectional identities that are more harmful than they are good, right? So we want to look at that. We want to look at retaliation, right? That's a huge barrier for a lot of survivors. If I tell you what has happened to me, right, are you going to retaliate against me? Also, disbelief, Disbelief is a huge part, especially we see it a lot, especially in law enforcement, right? If I come in and I report that I've been sexually assaulted, am I going to be believed? And if I'm not going to be believed, again, why would I continue to ask for help? Language barriers. Some of y'all talked about that in the chat, right? This is going to be extremely important in our organizations that we have access to language helplines, right? So if we don't have someone in our organization that can speak a different language, do we have access to a resource, right? So if someone who's Hispanic speaking comes in and wants help, do you have access to a resource that can get them the help that they need or access to a translator, right? Because oftentimes language barriers is the thing that keeps people from getting help, right? I'll give a perfect example. I recently was at a doctor's visit and I remember there was a Spanish speaking woman that came in and she had to pull out her phone and use like Google Translate or something to communicate to the person at the doctor's office. Because of that language barrier, she was getting frustrated, and you could tell that she was pregnant, and she was getting frustrated because there was no one in the office that could speak Spanish. This is so important, right? Because we know that when working with marginalized communities, we're not just working with people of color. Working with, the Latinx. We're working with indigenous. We're working with so many other populations. So we want to make sure that we have those resources in place. Another barrier can be stereotypes and misconceptions, right? Again, we talked about perception, right? For a lot of survivors, perception is reality. So their biggest fear is that you're going to stereotype me, right? You're going to look at me, you're going to see the way that I'm dressed, and you're going to automatically stereotype me. Or you're going to have this misconception of who I am based on my race, based on my gender, based on the color of my skin. All of these things play a role in why we don't accept services. And then the last barrier is lack of trauma-informed care. This is going to be very, very important in our organizations because we have to understand that everybody responds to trauma differently, right? But the other thing we have to understand is that everybody has some form of trauma. Even your coworkers have some form of trauma. And so when we are creating organizations to help our survivors, we have to make sure that we are putting trauma-informed care at the forefront. And so that oftentimes looks like working together with the survivor to address their needs, asking them what do they want, empowering them to make the right decision and what's best for them. Not projecting our own thoughts and our own feelings and our own emotions, but really helping them to understand that you are here as a partner. You are here to guide them through this process, and you are here to empower them to make the best decision for them. So let's talk a little bit about moving forward, right? Because we know the old way is not working, right? And so it is time to do a new thing. It is time to do something new. And so we want to make sure that as an organization that we are not only addressing these barriers, right? But we are assuring that we can help the people that we are called to help. And so one of the ways that we can do that is to be mindful of the ecological model, right? And so this model looks at different levels, right? So it looks at the individual, it looks at interpersonal, it looks at organizational, it looks at community, and then it looks at public policy, right? And so on this model, what we're essentially looking at is how does discrimination, oppression, microaggressions show up on all these levels, right? So when you are home, I want you to think about and reflect on your work and think about what are some ways that you can begin to make your work more inclusive to people of all identities, right? and think about it from each level's standpoint. So, how can I be more inclusive to the individuals that I work with? How can I be more inclusive from an interpersonal standpoint? How can I be a little more inclusive in an organizational standpoint, right? How can I be more inclusive from a community base? And then what does that look like in public policy, right? And so when we're thinking of inclusivity, from an individual standpoint, we're thinking about what the knowledge and the attitudes and the skills that we have, right? So we want to make sure that we avoid assumptions when we're working with individuals, right? We don't want to assume anything. We want to go in to our conversations with survivors, being aware of our own implicit bias, making sure that we're not assuming their identities, that we're going in with an open heart and an open mind, right? So we want to be very mindful of those things when working with individuals, right? And then from an interpersonal standpoint, you want to look at your own self, right? So you want to take a minute to look at your own self and ask yourself, am I aware of my own biases? Am I aware of my own preconceived notions? Am I aware of my own stigmas, right? And how are they showing up? Because they do show up, right? So we want to make sure that when we are doing this work, that we're paying attention to how our own stuff shows up, right? And so interpersonal work can also look like increasing your own social network. So are you taking the time to maybe read things about marginalized communities, watch things on marginalized communities, getting involved in your own community? So going to different community events outside of your own social network. Are you, paying attention to what marginalized communities are talking about in mainstream media? All of those things can play a role in how we do better and make sure that we are being more inclusive. From an organizational standpoint, we're looking at our environment, we're looking at our institutions, right? So, do we have ways of communicating with anyone who comes in? So, remember, we said language was a barrier. So, are we looking at our resources? Are we looking at do we have someone that can translate? Do we have ASL interpreters, right, on standby? What do we need to have in place from an organizational standpoint to ensure that any survivor that walks through our doors, we're ready to service them, right? And that we don't have to turn around and send them somewhere else because we're not equipped. The other thing we want to look at is, who are we hiring? We talked about lack of representation being a barrier, right? So we want to pay attention to that. Who are we hiring? Are we hiring people that represent the population that we're servicing, right? We also want to look at our paperwork and our forms. Are our policies and our procedures inclusive? Are they cultivating safe and supportive environments, not just for the survivors, but for everyone, right? Are we adhering to gender identity and gender expression? Are we affirming identities? Are we allowing our staff and even the clients we work with to use their pronouns? All of these things we should be paying attention to from an organizational standpoint, right? And then a community standpoint. From a community standpoint, we want to look at what are the needs of our community? What are the needs of the communities that we are servicing? What are the needs of the communities that we are showing up for, right? So we're looking at the relationship between the community and our organizations. We're looking at cultural values. We're looking at norms, right? Are we, as organizations, are we collaborating with other organizations that are servicing other populations? So one of the things I love about the work I do here at MCASA is I have an opportunity to collaborate with other organizations, right, that are still servicing survivors, but they're servicing survivors in other communities, right? So what does our outreach efforts look like? Are we reaching out to the different communities and asking for their opinions and asking for feedback, right? From a community standpoint, are we looking at our transportation options, right? Are they accessible? Because again, we know that lack of transportation is a barrier to being able to get the help that we need. So are we making sure that those things are accessible, right? And then also from a community standpoint, are you working with your local officials, right? Are you working with those that we are putting in office to ensure that we're creating inclusive laws that are not harmful, right? And then the last part of this model is public policy. So from a public policy standpoint, are we voting? Are we advocating for positive legislation? Are we doing everything we need to do on the state and local level to ensure that our policies, that our laws, right, that our regulations, again, and foster that safe and supportive and inclusive environment for everyone? So let's talk a little bit about equity versus equality, right? So if you look at, and I'm sure some of you have seen this picture, right? Equality basically says that everyone is treated equally, right? Regardless of what they got going on, everybody gets the same services, the same accommodations, right? Now we know that does not work, right? And you can look at this picture, right? For example, the young woman in the wheelchair. She can't get on that bike, right? And so this is one of the reasons why we have to begin to move away from equality and more into equity, right? Because equity says that we can take these individuals, right, and give them not the exact same resource, right, but give them the resources that they need, right? And so this is how we begin to move from a place of everybody gets everything to now being identifying who needs what, because equity we know is not a one size fit all. This is not one size fit all, right? And so we as organizations, we want to make sure that in the work that we are doing, that we are not taking an equality approach, but we are taking an equity approach, right? And so again, this looks like we are being creative with our resources, policies, paperwork, our supportive services, our money, the staff that we're hiring. All of those things play a role in being able to shift from an equality standpoint to an equity standpoint. Because again, our goal is to be more inclusive, right? We want to be more inclusive in our interactions, in our organizations, even in our legislation. And so again, equality is treating others how we want to be treated, and equity is more about treating others how they want to be treated. So, for the last time, I want you to share with me what are some things you're going to take away from today's training? Drop them in the chat. What are you going to walk away with? I'll give y'all a few minutes because I know we're a little over time. Helping our community be able to access our resources that are specific to their needs. Love the slide on equity versus equality. Yes. Mm-hmm. Not judging survivors. I love that. Love the last slide, equity versus equality. Yep. Walking into every situation with an open mind, not being quick to judge, taking time to consider every possible battle. Yes. And ensuring we as advocates remove any barriers. Continued education. Yes. I love it. When working with immigrants, it is important to validate their stories and be open to their culture, knowing what your resources are, even more barriers of reporting, evaluating my own biases about marginalized populations. Love the slide on equality versus equity and your explanation about the difference. Cultural awareness, reminder of barriers, clients having experience receiving assistance. Yep. Assume nothing, take more of an equitable approach to individualized services and care, acknowledge that we all have biases and being able to check them, acknowledging the gaps and encouraging to educate others. I love this. Becoming more culturally humble, trying to remember we all have biases and how to counteract them. Yes, I love this. Yes. Okay, I saw one more. Remember that intersectionality affects how people ask for what they need and acknowledge what they need and try to be open to all. Learn from your clients. Yes. I love all of these. Good job, y'all. All right. Well, that concludes our time today. Again, it has been my pleasure. Again, I'm Leah Forney, the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate here at MCASA. That is my contact information. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message.